seemed happy and hopeful.
As we meet here today, we stand on the threshold of a new era of peace in the world.
In fact, he stood on the threshold of disaster and disgrace. For by January '73, his presidency was also winding down. Its ending had its beginning the previous June at this office hotel residential complex called the Watergate, where several Republican operatives were caught inside the Democrats' headquarters. And by January '73, this man, James McCord, one of the 7 men on trial for the break-in, was telling federal judge John Sirica that Mr. Nixon's aides had not only committed perjury during the trial, but that the White House had tried to buy the defendant's silence with cash and presidential pardons and good jobs when they'd served their time.
I had no knowledge of the Watergate at all, no involvement in it.
Almost overnight, Watergate became a synonym for scandal, as the burglary was revealed as merely the tip of a much broader conspiracy funded by the Nixon Re-Election Committee, designed to sabotage the Democrats and approved by this man, John Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States. The question then was the President of the United States involved?
I began by telling the President that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the President himself would be killed by it.
John Dean, the young White House counsel in charge of a cover-up that was rapidly unraveling. And as it did, the casualties began to mount. H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, Mr. Nixon's right-hand men, fired, though defended for their loyalty.
I will not place the blame on subordinates, on people whose zeal exceeded their judgment, and who may have done wrong in a cause they deeply believe to be right.
But at the Senate Watergate hearings, no one could find a hero, though as a long list of crimes and dirty tricks began to emerge before the American public, Mr. Nixon himself emerged relatively unscathed.
In all of the millions of words of testimony, there is not the slightest suggestion that I had any knowledge of the planning for the Watergate break-in. As for the cover-up, my statement has been challenged by only one of the 35 witnesses who appeared.
Challenged by the man in charge of protecting him, John Dean. He'd made a deal with the government in return for his testimony that Mr. Nixon was indeed part of the cover-up. And challenged as well by this man, White House aide Alexander Butterfield, who said Oval Office conversations were routinely recorded on taping devices.
There was no doubt in my mind that they were installed to record things for posterity.
Certainly not for the Watergate Committee, and Nixon refused to hand over the tapes.
This is a rather remarkable letter about the tapes. If you notice, the President says he's heard the tapes, or some of them, and they sustain his position. But he says he's not going to let anybody else hear them, for fear they might draw a different conclusion.
In October '73, fed up with the efforts of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox to get his hands on the tapes, the President fired him. Attorney General Elliot Richardson and much of the senior staff at the Justice Department resigned in protest. And the Saturday Night Massacre prompted Congress to consider Mr. Nixon's impeachment. He backed down, appointed a new prosecutor, handed over some of the tapes, and blamed it all on reporters.
And yet, don't get the impression that you arouse my anger. You see,
I have that impression.
One can only be angry with those he respects.
October ended with an 18-minute gap in one of the tapes. Just an accidental erasure, said his secretary Rosemary Woods, who then demonstrated how it might have happened. Few believed her. The president struggled on, by then under fire for spending millions of government dollars on his estates and for paying almost no taxes as president.
And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
But in March '74, when 7 of his top aides were indicted, he was named as their fellow criminal conspirator. In July '74, the Supreme Court ordered him to release the tapes, and the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach him. In early August, on one of the tapes, he was heard to ask the CIA to block the FBI's Watergate investigation. He was clearly part of the cover-up. That was the smoking gun. 4 days later, on August 9th, after decades of seeking the White House, but only 2,000 days as president, he resigned with this emotional benediction to his staff.
Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you. But those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
And having done precisely that, he was gone. One of the preeminent politicians of post-war America, trapped in the tangled web of Watergate, he had helped to weave. Jim Wooten, ABC News, Washington.
Jim Wooten now joins us from our Washington Bureau. Jim, just at the outset, tell me how much angst there was in that period, and tell those particularly who weren't old enough during that period.
It was not an era that anyone living now or before would ever imagine could have happened in American politics or government. You had days and weeks and months in which a president of the United States was under rather constant siege, both by the Congress and in the press, for criminal wrongdoings. It was an era what I would not like to see repeated, and I expect that most members of the press feel the same way.
You hear often from President Nixon in retirement, and you certainly hear it from many of his supporters, that the press was out to get him, unquestionably. Is that the way the Washington Press Corps felt in those days?
I couldn't speak for the rest of the Washington Press Corps. I would say that Mr. Nixon was probably always his own worst enemy when it came to dealings with the press. I think he believed for many, many years before he ever became president that most reporters were not interested in any success in his career. He accepted that as a given. He regarded them always not simply as adversaries in the general give and take between politician and media, but as real enemies and foes. That affected his dealings with them, and I expect that affected the way they dealt with them.
A number of people have said to me in the last couple of days, when, of course, everybody knew this was coming, that Richard Nixon's behavior in his relationship with the press has changed the way the presidency will be treated in this country by the press forever. What do you think?
Well, I expect that after the era of Woodward and Bernstein and the era of Watergate and the actual resignation of a presidency as a consequence of what began simply as newspaper investigations, I expect that presidents are treated differently now. I expect that most members of the press don't regard the presidency as quite as sacred or as holy as they might have before.
Thank you, Jim, very much. Jim Wooten, our political reporter in Washington. A number of people have made the point that President Roosevelt, President Kennedy, President Eisenhower, President Truman had conferred on them just by being in the presidency a kind of nobility, and that with Richard Nixon that all disappeared. And some people will argue, of course, that the kind of treatment Bill Clinton gets today from the press has something to do with the relationship that Richard Nixon had with the media during his final days in office. We're joined by another reporter now who's seen a lot of Mr. Nixon in his retirement period, Michael Kramer, the political writer from Time magazine. Michael, you went out to New Jersey often and you sat down with him. Did he come to terms, do you think, with his legacy?
I don't know if he came to terms with it, but he certainly tried to massage it. Jim spoke about how he always felt that those of us journalists were his enemies. Afterwards, after he resigned, I think he tried to co-opt us, make us allies, make us tools of his rehabilitation. And he was very assiduous at doing it.
How did he do it?
And very successful. I think he did it basically by force of intellect. Whatever you can say about the man, he certainly had quite a brain. And freed from the responsibility of election or re-election, he turned everything toward rehabilitating himself in the area of foreign policy, which was his suit. And it was really quite remarkable.
It is sometimes said that his intellect in foreign policy in these latter years has been somewhat overrated. Now, you write about foreign policy as well as domestic. Make a judgment about that, if you would, and then add what you think his his most considerable foreign policy legacy will be?
Well, I think that those who would say it's overrated have to answer the question compared with what.
Good point.
With the possible exception of his Confederate, Henry Kissinger, I don't think it's possible to compare him with anyone else. And even Kissinger, I think, in some of his quieter moments, gives a lot of the credit for the promulgation of foreign policy during Nixon's presidency to the president himself. I think in recent times, one of the most interesting things that Nixon has done, and he did it during the 1992 campaign, was cause both President Bush and then Governor Clinton to get on the bandwagon to support reform in Russia. And I think it was a real question at that point whether or not either of them would do that. I think he propelled that debate. He gave it an intellectual underpinning, and it's where we are today. Now, you can argue with a policy. You can say that we've gone too far, but I think it has its genesis with the clarity of thought that he brought to how to treat Russia in the post-Soviet period.
Michael, just stay with us for a second, just so I remind people exactly what has happened. President Nixon, 37th president, died at 9:08 here at New York Hospital. He had a...
Oh, you need...
Went into a deep coma last night. It was literally only a matter of time. We knew pretty much this afternoon that he might not last throughout the evening. His family, his two daughters, and their husbands have been up here in New York through the day. The president, as you may have heard over the last couple of days, had participated in what's sometimes called a living will, which was that he decided for himself before he became extremely ill that he didn't want any extraordinary measures used to try to keep him alive. Beyond that, we're not altogether sure what the family has decided, though they do not want, we're told, a state funeral in Washington, that he will be buried in California, where Mrs. Nixon, his beloved wife, who died a year ago, was buried. And beyond that, we simply do not know. But we are waiting for President Clinton to come and make a statement in the White House in about a minute and a half from now. We are joined also, as I said, people were coming in from around the country here in New York, by Tom Wicker, former reporter, political reporter, former columnist for the New York Times, who wrote a very well-known book about Richard Nixon called One of Us. Tom, you may have only, I'm over here a bit, if you can look a little to your right. Tom, there we are, thank you. We have only about a minute and a half at the moment, but you've written so extensively about, give us a first impression of how you remember him.
Well, I think Mr. Nixon was one of the most informed and thoughtful presidents that we've had. He was known for secluding himself in a room and putting together his own speeches, maybe not the final text, but the general outline of it. And I think most presidents have not been that inner-directed.
You told me the other day why you had given your book about the president the title One of Us. I'm not sure we can squeeze it in a minute, but try.
Well, because I thought that he shared many of the qualities that most of the American people do. They don't perhaps like to admit it, but he had said himself that you have to understand the dark side of the American people in order to deal with them, something to that effect, and I think that was true.
This is a president about whom almost immediately upon his death, people are talking about the dark side as well as the upside.
Well, it was very visible.
I was thinking a little about the appellation, the nickname Tricky Dick. Where did he get that?
He got that in the 1950 campaign against Helen Gahagan Douglas. It was her enduring revenge for being defeated by Richard Nixon that she pinned that nickname on him.
This was the very first Richard Nixon, the anti-communist, in America's preoccupation with the Cold War right after the war. He rode anti-communism through the Helen Gahagan Douglas campaign and through many others, didn't he?
Yes, and through the exposure, if that's what it was, of Alger Hiss. That was what brought him first to the attention of the American public.
What was it about him that impressed you in this regard? He was an anti-communist who went to China. He ended 23 years of American isolation of China. He was an anti-communist who started the process of détente and nuclear arms reduction. What was it about him that made him make that corner?
Well, he was a very contradictory character. He was generally regarded as a Republican conservative, but he was not a doctrinaire conservative. He had a horror, for example, of unemployment. He imposed wage and price controls for the first time in peacetime that any president had ever done. Nixon was a strange and contradictory character in that way, but in particular, he was interested in foreign affairs and devoted himself to that.
Tom, hang on with us for a second, as I've asked everybody else to do. Barbara Walters, we cannot help but talk about Richard Nixon without talking about Henry Kissinger. Barbara Walters talked to Kissinger just yesterday about the Nixon legacy. Barbara, why don't you introduce this for us?